Welcome back to the show, everybody. This is Pasta to Go. I am your host, Craig Pasta Jardula. I am here with my lovely co-host for today, Tatiana Moroz, and our guest right now, Derrick Broze. Man, I'm amped up today. I really am. I was excited to do the show. It's crazy because there's so much bad news out there, Derrick. However, this is your article really quickly. Let me just show it before we introduce Derrick. One of the articles he has up on the Last American Vagabond. Everything you need to know about the week one of the second phase of the Fluoride Lawsuit. So there's a lot of things to break down, and we'll talk about them. Let me get to a clean screen. Let's bring up Derrick Broze, ladies and gentlemen. He is here, and Tatiana Moroz will be in the background. She'll join after Derrick gives us a little knowledge about what's going on. Derrick, thank you so much for joining the show. Let's get his name over here. We got Tatiana Moroz's name, and let's get Derrick's name in there. There it is. Derrick Broze, I always call you a truther. You say, I don't know if about all these labels, but you're always seeking the truth. I loved it, the fact that you were running for mayor of Houston. I thought that was awesome. A lot of people criticize me for wanting people to run for office, even though I report on elections, and a lot of the elections are going to be fugazi. However, I think it's important for us to get our voice out there. There are certain discussions that will never have been had in Houston if it wasn't for a Derrick Broze running for office. So thank you right off the bat for that. And thank you for staying on this whole fluoride situation, because I think this is being swept under the rug. And if it wasn't for people like yourself who reported on all the craziness in Utah, a lot of people wouldn't have known about that. Why don't you educate us on what's going on over here? I have questions for you, but just let it rip. Start from the basic bottom ups of what is actually going on, what you have been following, and what you have to report to us today.
Thank you, brother, for that. So I have been following this federal fluoride lawsuit, which was filed originally in 2017. It is the result of a petition that was filed by the Fluoride Action Network, Moms Against Fluoridation, and a few other plaintiffs, Food and Water Watch, and a couple other groups, and some moms. In 2016, they filed a petition to the EPA under what's known as the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA. And with TSCA, us as U.S. citizens, we can file petitions if we believe a chemical or a compound is toxic in some way. And the EPA is supposed to review this, and if they conclude that it's correct, then they either ban it or they regulate it. There's different actions they can take. So these individuals filed this petition providing plenty of studies and scientific data showing that fluoride is a neurotoxin and lowers IQ in children, particularly during prenatal and postnatal when the mom's pregnant and right afterwards. And the EPA denied the petition, so they filed suit. The Fluoride Action Network, their attorney, Michael Connett, they filed suit, and it was sort of just legal proceedings, nothing really happening for a couple of years. But the first phase, when they actually went to trial, was in summer of 2020. And it was COVID lockdown, so everything was on Zoom. And I was live tweeting and documenting, reporting on this for the Last American Vagabond about the first phase of the trial. And there was a lot of big things that came out of that. But ultimately, the judge said, let's put things on hold for now, because at the time there was a study that was about to come out from the U.S. National Toxicology Program. The biggest review of all of the fluoride literature out there was looking at high quality, low risk of bias studies. And the judge said, look, this study is about to come out, so before we go forward, let's just wait, because the assumption at the time was it was going to be 6 months to maybe a year or so. That was 2020. And here we are, 2024. Things have just restarted here in 2024 because the study never came out. The study was, as we learned, because of emails obtained through the lawyers in this lawsuit, they were able to file open records requests and, of course, do discovery, get all sorts of communications between the CDC's Oral Health Division as well as within the HHS, Health and Human Services, that specifically mentioned that Assistant Secretary of Health Rachel Levine, formerly known as Richard Levine, specifically is mentioned as having blocked the release of this national toxicology report. And more specifically, we have emails showing the NTP scientists themselves saying, our report is ready to release. They were apparently ready to publish it May 2022. They had chosen the date. They said they were going to publish it on their servers and make it public. And while that conversation was going on behind the scenes, these other elements of the U.S. government, mainly representing the dental health kind of water fluoridation proponents, were saying this study is never going to come out. And that's exactly what happened. The study never came out. The only reason we know about it, the only reason I was able to report on it, is because of this lawsuit and because of the emails that were obtained. And so that was all going on behind the scenes the last couple of years. And now finally, we just restarted. Started January 31st. It was 2 weeks in San Francisco. I just got home from San Francisco a couple of days ago. I spent 2 weeks out there in the courtroom, live tweeting, and I've written. You showed one article. We have a second article about week 2, and probably as we're doing this report right here, my third article on today's proceedings, which was the final proceedings, will be published on The Last American Vagabond. And I can get more into the details about some of the other big revelations, but that's basically where we've been. They've been trying to prove and bringing in expert witnesses to show that fluoride is a neurotoxin, and the EPA, the government, is basically trying to say there's no evidence of that, or actually they're for the first time ever admitting that there is harm, but they're claiming that it's at levels way higher than the CDC recommends. And so that's kind of where we're at.
Would it be fair to say that this was a stonewalling by the EPA and the courts to make sure that they can kick this can down the road? I believe it was almost 4 to 8 years they delayed this case so that it wouldn't. That is a tactic that we should point out, right? That's what they'll do. They'll make sure they draw it out as long as they can. Therefore, that the other side, in other words, the Fluoride Action Network would have to spend a ton of money to keep it going, and to hold on to any type of
they've already spent. Yeah, they've already spent quite a bit over the last 8 years, I'm sure. But yeah, exactly what you're describing was basically the EPA's attorneys, their strategy the last 2 weeks, and really the last 4 years the whole time, but specifically the last 2 weeks, the second phase. Their argument just kept coming back to, Judge, it's too unclear. The current allowable levels of water fluoridation, as recommended by the CDC in the United States, is 0.7 milligrams per liter. And so they're at least admitting, yes, above 2 milligrams, there's some harm, there's some neurotoxic effects. But once we get closer to 1.5, which is what the WHO recommends, and down to 0.7, it's much less clear, Judge. And so because it's so unclear, because it's uncertain, you shouldn't rule on this. We'll have to do more studies, more data, and yeah, just keep kicking the can down the road.
Let's understand who the players are. Who is the FAN, F-A-N, the Fluoride Action Network? How did they start? Where did they come from? Who are they, Derrick?
Sure. So they are, essentially, I would say they're activists, scientists, researchers who care about this issue. If I'm remembering correctly, it was founded by the Conant family. So Michael Conant, as I said, he's the lead attorney, but his father, Paul Conant, and his mother, Ellen Conant, they are the main founders of this, and they started this back in the early 2000s. I got to sit down with Michael while I was in San Francisco, the lead attorney, and you can find that interview on theconsciousresistance.com. And he told me a little bit of the story. He's basically just a really brilliant dude. He's been in law now for 20 plus years, and he got into this research at a very young age, and he spent years with some of the other advocates going to the National Archives, looking up studies from the 40s and the 50s. And so it really is kind of like a family project that has grown now to becoming this worldwide community. The Fluoride Action Network, their website, fluoridealert.org, is actually as far as I know, it's the world's largest database of fluoride studies. And not just studies that show harm, but just all the studies that exist out there, all the kinds of data. And they have been one of the leading advocates, I would say. And so in my view, that this family definitely is heroes. And as I'll illustrate here with some of the data, the reason this is important that the judge doesn't kick the can down the road, and that Michael Conant is doing such a great job to show the judge the real science. The reason that matters is because as the judge is trying to figure this out, mothers are still drinking fluoridated water, and their wombs, their babies, and they are still being exposed to it. And as they presented in the last 2 weeks, along the pregnancy, by the third trimester, as a mother is drinking more water, if she's drinking fluoridated water, she reaches ridiculous high amounts of fluoride in her body, and that starts to store in her body. And then when the baby starts to form its skeletal structure in that third trimester, they pull the fluoride right out of the mom's bones where it stores, and they go straight into the blood-brain barrier, the placenta. So we're dealing with a pretty bad situation here. And there's lead, there's other toxins, but the difference with fluoride is this is something that your tax dollars are paying to put in the water. That's the big difference. They are paying to put this in your water, claiming that it has some medical benefit. And that's another example of them taking away your choice to decide if you want fluoride or not.
So what are some of the myths and some of the truths about fluoride that you found out as you've been covering this case?
Well, I would say the biggest myth overall is just that, so if we go to the CDC's website right now and you look up the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century, you'll see vaccinations and you'll see water fluoridation, among other things. I would say that that's the biggest myth, that water fluoridation is this great public health achievement. I encourage everybody who wants to do a deeper dive than we have today to look up a book called The Fluoride Deception by journalist Christopher Bryson. And he wrote this book in the early 2000s, just an amazing piece of work looking into the history. And people have been told since the 40s and the 50s, when we first started seeing this idea promoted, that fluoride hardens your teeth, so it's good for your bones. And the idea is that all those poor people in the rural areas that don't have access to good dental care, this is going to help strengthen their bones and strengthen their teeth so that we can fight off, cavities and stuff like that. This has been disproven time and time again, even as recently as just this last week. Right now, the crazy thing about this lawsuit happening right now, the Canadian government and the UK government are actually considering beginning water fluoridation. Both those nations are not completely fluoridated. There are some communities in Canada. Europe is not fluoridated, but now the UK government is actually studying it at this moment to try to see if they're going to develop a water fluoridation program. And if you research UK Lotus study, it was just published this last week, the results of the Lotus study say that there is no measurable difference in terms of cavities, or what sometimes are called caries, just means cavities, whether you got fluoride or not. And in fact, one kind of byproduct or side effect of overexposure to fluoride is dental fluorosis, where you get this yellow and brown staining of the teeth. So it actually can cause harm to your teeth. The CDC says that that's just a cosmetic effect, though, because of the alleged benefits. So that's the number one myth, just this idea that it's good for your teeth, that it fights cavities. Because even I've heard some folks who say, you're right, fluoride is bad, or it's a waste of money, or I should have the choice. But it still does have these benefits. I don't even think any of that can stand the test of true science and scientific rigor. And the trial went over some of that data. The trial was mainly focused, of course, on neurotoxin effects. But if you start to study fluoride, you understand that it also affects the bones, as I was mentioning. That can lead to higher risks of arthritis, hip pain, bone pain, kidney issues. If you've already got kidney problems, the fluoride can accumulate within your kidney, and your body will have even more trouble getting rid of it. So it's really attacking the body in numerous different ways. This lawsuit, though, is exclusively focused on the neurotoxin effects. So I think those are probably the two biggest ones, that it fights cavities and that it's somehow good for your teeth. But when you look at the history of it, you can actually see that it started through a propaganda campaign that involved Edward Bernays, who's the father of modern propaganda, and this company called Alcoa, which is an aluminum company based. They were one of the first companies doing this, because what we call fluoride, is actually hydrofluoric acid and other similar components that are a byproduct of aluminum phosphate mining. So this isn't naturally occurring fluoride. And that's maybe the other myth. People say, okay, but what about naturally occurring fluoride? It does occur naturally in some parts of the world. But again, the data shows even natural fluoride exposure still can lead to these bone problems, to these hip problems, these joint problems, and all these other things we're seeing. So it doesn't appear that there's really any safe level of this chemical. And the EPA is trying to say it's unclear. We don't know, Judge. You shouldn't make a ruling. The Fluoride Action Network is essentially saying we might not be 100% clear at exactly what concentration of fluoride in the water is causing the harm, but we can clearly see there's harm. So we should err on the side of caution and consider the most vulnerable populations, which is what the EPA has done with every other previous risk assessment like this. So they're not asking them to do anything different or special.
Alcoa, you said, right? I remember Alcoa.
Yeah.
What I remember from them? They used to have football commercials. Alcoa can't wait. When I was like a little kid watching football, Alcoa was one of the sponsors. That's crazy. Here's a question that's not on my list, but after listening to you, then, if it has all these negative effects, why? Why does the state, counties, why do cities want to use this? Does it help them clean the water? Is it easier for them to use? I mean, what's the benefit? Those who put the fluoride in the water, what do they get out of it?
That's a good question. And, I could speculate, of course, as to what's the bigger why. I mean, there's a lot of people, let's say, who are concerned about this issue, who believe that
you're a truther, so it probably be something great. The reason why.
I was going to say, there's some people who believe that this has to do with, dumbing people down, dumbing the population. And I have for years felt not confident to sort of stamp my name next to that assessment. Of course, I look around and I'm like, hey, it's hard not to feel that maybe there is a purposeful agenda here, because, the reality, man, is that when you look at this data and the stuff that I've been researching fluoride since 2010, this is one of the first things I started to kind of wake up to. But I learned a lot the last 2 weeks. And we have scientific data, as was presented in court, going back to the 1930s, going back to the scientist named Kai Roham, a Danish scientist, who was the first person to discover skeletal fluorosis when he studied these mining workers in Greenland. And he found that they were being exposed to fluoride. It was causing all these bone problems. And he was the first person. He wrote the book in 1937, so almost 100 years ago. So then when you start to realize that, and you learn about people like William Marcus, who was an EPA whistleblower who tried to blow the whistle about fluoride back in the 90s, and he was, he had a whole bunch of issues. You can look him up. The mainstream was even reporting on it back then. You start to realize this data isn't new. There's a lot of good stuff coming out of this trial, but it's not new. The information is there for the people who've been willing to look. And this kind of gets to the picture of, I don't know if I can quite answer the why. Maybe it is a dumbing down. There are definitely financial interests. But I think the other aspect is that if Judge Chen rules on the side of the plaintiffs and says, yes, fluoride is a neurotoxin and it must be banned, and that would send ripples around the world. Not only would, already this case, I think if we can get it in front of more people, it has the power to give people on the local level who like to go fight for these issues and try to get their town council or city council to abandon water fluoridation. There's so much good information that has come out of this lawsuit. You have now more ammo for your fight. But if the judge rules this, that would potentially open up the CDC, the FDA, the ADA, and all these organizations, government and non-governmental, to class action lawsuits. If parents start saying, did my child lose a couple of IQ points? Is my liver messed up because of water fluoridation? Do I have arthritis because I've been drinking fluoride my whole life? So I definitely think there is a huge financial incentive to keep this out of the public's eye. This is why there's no corporate media reporting on it. And I think they're just hoping that the judge will do what the EPA wants and that it'll disappear and nobody will ever even knew this happened.
Let's bring my co-host in. Tati, I think they're trying to use the fluoride, combine it with the 5G to give people illnesses and whatnot. Jamie, let's bring Tati in here because I want to get her opinion on what she thinks. Tati, you got any questions for Derrick right off the bat before I keep going? Because this is some fascinating things. For me, it's like, well, why would they use it, right? Like, does it make their life easier? But no, there's always maybe these, I don't want to say conspiracy theories, but maybe they're trying to dumb us down. Maybe they're trying to keep us sick. Maybe this is part of the master plan. Your thoughts, Tati?
I'm sick and tired of being called a conspiracy theorist for seeing things that are written blatantly on the wall, right? I think that there's a lot of people who've been awake for a long time, and we have this, I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to say anything crazy, but like the things that are crazy are the generally accepted assumptions, right? Like, why do we have to say, I can't imagine why they would want to dumb us down. We just can't figure out. And these are people who brought in the Nazis and were like, we should have these guys work for us. These are not your friends. And I think that the sooner that people get used to that, the better. I wanted to maybe ask Derrick, like, all right, what's going to be the implications of this? Are people going to get into trouble? And I don't even want to bother asking him because I know that there's going to be nothing that happens. There's probably going to be like, oh, it's good for babies. Here, have some more. And I don't really see that many changes happening. But again, this is like a symptom of a larger, like all of these different aspects of the corruption of our free society that we live in, America. And don't get me wrong, I love America and I like what America stands for, but it's a big illusion. And the world is filled with a lot of illusions that are coming down. I think it's great for people to realize that fluoride is bad. I've been using fluoride-free toothpaste for a long time. And now I'm thinking, man, I need to get that reverse osmosis going so it's not messing with me in the shower. But I mean, fluoride obviously is bad for you. I'm glad that people are catching on. I find it irritating that it takes 7,000 million years for anybody to pay attention. And it's not like it's almost, it reminds me a little bit about the chemtrails thing. Like, well, of course, weather modification exists. You silly Willy. Like, they just skipped over the fact that, yeah, now they're just admitting that there's weather modification and chemtrails. So what happened to all the things where they had what are you so stupid? You can't tell it's condensation? Yeah, I can tell it's condensation because when I look out the thing and I see the trail going and dissipating, I know that that's something different than the one that has a big skyline that messes up my day for the rest of the, afternoon. So it's just preposterous that we're even pretending that any of this isn't going on. I think the real question is like, what could we do that's realistic besides telling everybody to vote and do stupid crap like that? Because those systems are corrupt. And I'd be curious to see about other kinds of alternative systems that Derrick's involved in. Derrick, you've been like a community builder for a long time. Like, this is obviously not that shocking to you that we're kind of targeted. Do you think that there are some hopeful points from not just this story, but from the stuff that we're all facing now as society's veil is lifted?
You know, in terms of the lawsuit and maybe even the broader picture, I try to remain skeptically optimistic. You know, I'm not like black-pilled where I think everything's screwed and there's no hope or anything like that. But obviously, we've seen time and time again where the crooks get away with things, and it's like, okay, would it be a big surprise if nothing happens with this, right? No, of course, none of us would be surprised. We would be surprised if something positive comes out of this because it seems so few and far between. But I do think more people are waking up. I mean, I can say that just through my little efforts here, and of course I was going reporting with the Last American Vagabond. I do want to shout out that my trip out there was completely crowdfunded. As you know, Craig, it takes a lot of work to get out there and, you know, do this stuff. So we had people raise $6,000 that covered my cost to be in expensive San Francisco for 2 weeks and be able to eat a little bit and survive. So thank you to everybody who cared enough to do that. I appreciate that. And, you know, because of you guys and I've been on, this is my 4th interview today talking about the fluoride lawsuit from platforms big and small. Way more people are listening to it than they were 2 weeks ago when it was just starting. And I know that's because of my effort, because of the effort of people like yourself and others, you know, obviously Michael Connett, the people fighting this lawsuit. Like there definitely, I think, in terms of fluoride and maybe even some other bigger issues, more people questioning. Now, in terms of whether that leads to actual change, that's a whole nother thing, right? Because you could be awake to all kinds of things, and it doesn't mean it's going to stop or anything necessarily gets better. And as far as people protecting themselves from this specific situation, I mean, the reason I think that this case could be big if the judge rules in favor of the plaintiffs, besides the reasons I already mentioned, is it would make it much easier for people to be able to protect themselves. You know, what some of the last things I want to share in just a moment is just quotes directly from the scientists I interviewed, especially because this is apparently is affecting women way worse. Obviously, we're talking about pregnant women, but there was also studies on the thyroid impacting women. And that's why I think it's important because, you know, I can afford to buy a shower filter and I have multiple 5-gallon jugs that are BPA free that I go to the local water filter station and fill up multiple times a week. I don't drink fluoridated water, try not to shower in it. You know, if I go out to eat, I'm aware that I'm probably going to be served fluoridated water. I try to limit my exposure, but as always, the person who's going to be impacted the most, the people who are going to be impacted the most are those of lower socioeconomic status who can't afford to, you know, don't have the time or the car to put 5-gallon, jugs in their car and go fill it up and all this stuff, or buy a shower filter or a home filter, which sometimes can be expensive. So it would be government action, it would be court action, but it would be the easiest fix to just, hey, stop adding the poison to the water. How about that? Beyond that, it's going to take people fighting on the local level. And there are examples. I mean, there's a couple of cities in Texas where I'm originally from that have gotten rid of fluoride. There's a county in Florida that just this week decided to stop fluoridating, but it's just piece by piece by piece here. And meanwhile, billions of people are consuming this poison, and their children, they're going to produce more children with potentially lowered IQ, and we'll never know, you know, what those could be. Who knows if we lost IQ points, you know, of our exposure. Our moms are probably drinking fluoridated water, you know, for all we know. And so I think there's just some real world consequences here. And if I can, Costa, can I go ahead and share just this quote or two here? I want to read from Dr. Who, if you don't mind.
Please do. Go ahead.
So Dr. Howard Hu is one of the Fluoride Action Network expert witnesses who testified in week 1. And he was a principal investigator in this big Mexico study called the Element Study that looked at pregnant mothers and found this association of fluoride and lower IQ. And this is what he told me. This is his words. He said, quote, "I would say that in my view, the evidence is quite persuasive that there is a negative impact of fluoride exposure on the neurodevelopment of children, particularly the research that's been coming out in prenatal exposure." The second witness was Dr. Bruce Lanphier, he's one of the leading experts in the world on lead. It's actually his work which the EPA based their standards for lead toxicity. And so now he's trying to, you know, ring alarm bells about fluoride and raise awareness about this. And I asked him again about the NTP, the National Toxicology Program, their studies on fluoride and IQ. And he said, quote, "Well, what we found, whether we looked at urinary fluoride levels from the mom as a measure of exposure or water fluoride as an estimate of fluoride intake during pregnancy, in every case, we saw IQ deficits in the children." And then Dr. Lanphier went even further, and he told me about hypothyroidism. And he said, quote, "What we found is that women who are exposed to higher amounts of fluoride, especially if it's in the water or if it's a measure of fluoride intake, we saw an increased risk of those women developing hypothyroidism." And, he said there needs to be more research on this, but overall he said, quote, there's about a 65% increase in hypothyroidism in women when they're exposed to fluoride constantly. So hypothyroidism, obviously your thyroid is important in all kinds of things. And when it's messed with, it can mess some things up pretty bad. And the final witness I want to share about is Dr. Philippe Grandjean. He is the lead expert on mercury. Again, the EPA used his data to develop their standards on mercury, and the Fluoride Action Network brought him over from Denmark to testify. And he said a bunch of great things, but I just want to share, because you asked earlier, Pasta, about like why and who wouldn't want this information to get out? What is the resistance? Well, Dr. Grandjean, who again is one of the world's most renowned experts in toxicity, his work has been used by the EPA. He worked with Harvard. He was invited to speak at the World Health Organization and work with them. In 2020, during the first phase of the trial, he said something just sort of offhand, like, I was threatened at the World Health Organization, and he never elaborated. So when I finally met him last week, I asked him to elaborate on what exactly happened at Harvard and what exactly happened at the WHO. And so I just want to read you guys these quotes really quickly, just to emphasize the amount of influence that is trying to prevent this information from coming out. He said, quote, a professor from Harvard came to my office and asked me to sign a statement that my work on fluoride had nothing to do with water fluoridation. He actually wrote this draft, and since I didn't sign this immediately, he instead went to my dean and had the dean sign a statement that he supported water fluoridation in accordance with the CDC. He said that the leadership at Harvard told him that his research was unwanted, and he said, quote, because we couldn't agree on what I would consider my academic freedom, I left Harvard. And then when I asked him about the World Health Organization, he said he had been brought on as an advisor to help the World Health Organization develop environmental health criteria on fluoride. And as he started to gather all his data and kind of put together a draft report, he said, quote, they inserted changes in my draft indicating that fluoride could perhaps be toxic, but only at immense concentrations. I protested and said that in accordance with the scientific documentation, it would be wrong to insert the word immense. And so the WHO published a document without my name because I had asked to have my name stricken, but then they inserted some other colleague's name as the author of the draft, which is of course erroneous. But that was what the WHO felt was necessary in order to protect the interests of water fluoridation.
Derrick Broze, your work is unprecedented. Really, to tell you the truth, the stuff that you come up with, the stuff that you find is amazing, and I'm so glad that you're out there spreading your knowledge, and I hope you go on more shows and continue to get this information out there. I'm going to look more into this whole situation. Now I don't even know if I should shower anymore with the fluoride in my water, that it might be the cause of my goddamn eczema. I didn't even look at that. There's so many things I'm looking at, like the vaccines,
it could be
the military, and all this other stuff. I mean, where are we safe? What can we do? I mean, where do we got to go to be safe from these evil bastards that are trying to kill us in every single shape or form? You can't even shower now. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, thank you guys for giving me the time to share about this. And I do hope everybody who's hearing this, especially if this is new to you and you're kind of finally like, okay, maybe fluoride's not a conspiracy, go to thecontrastresistance.com. You can see my water fluoridation category. Everything I've reported on fluoride for the last 10 years is there. You can see my writing on thelastAmericanVagabond.com and find all of my articles for the last 4 years, including one that was just published today about today's final hearings and the closing arguments. And at this point, it's all up to Judge Chen. We expect a ruling in the next few weeks, next month or so. He will decide who's going to win this lawsuit.
Guys, go follow his work, especially if you want to hear what the closing arguments are, because I really, really want to know how the EPA attacked this, how they try to defend themselves. So please, everybody, go to Derrick Broze's website. Check it out, Last American Vagabond. Thank you so much, Derrick Broze. We'll see you soon. Do you have any old T-shirts from when you were running for mayor?
I still do have Broze for Mayor shirts. I'll send you one.
Can I get one, please?
Yeah.
I can probably fit in a large. It might be a little tight, but I've lost a few pounds. Maybe I can get a large.
I'm looking at a gray and a blue large. What color are you?
Give me one extra large blue and one large gray, and we'll see which works best.
Okay, cool. And I see Tatiana. We'll get you both one.
You got it, brother. Thank you so much. You have a great day.
All right, guys.